Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Through Bitter Seas by Phillip Parotti, narrated by Peter Lerman. Through bitter seas we wandered, toil without joy. Words once heard on a ship's bridge in the Pacific. 1. When the Akanapi first came off the ways, she didn't have a name. Instead, she had a number, YP-74A. The A thrown in to distinguish her from YP-74B, her sister ship, a vessel built by the same shipbuilding yard in San Diego and launched with her on the same day in 1940. Both of them were designated for use by Millard Mallet & Sons, a firm which maintained a sizable tuna fleet that had earned a solid reputation for bringing home a steady catch from the waters west of Peru. New and in excellent condition, the vessels had been commandeered by the US Navy following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Their immense engines, matched with their 469-ton displacement and 131-foot length, gave them what the Navy believed to be viability for use as seagoing utility vessels and tugboats in forthcoming operations. YP-74B, by whatever quirk motivated the Navy's Pacific Service Force, had been dispatched to San Francisco as soon as she'd been commissioned and reconfigured as a tug. YP-74A, steaming in company with transports and supply ships, had been dispatched in the opposite direction and sent to Pearl Harbor under the command of a warrant officer, a chief machinist, a man whose considerable technical expertise as an engineer was nevertheless found to be deficient for both navigation and fleet operations. He was relieved without prejudice once the task force reached Pearl and replaced with the sandy-haired lieutenant junior grade Ted Hyde, who had experience with both. Hal, properly named Harold B. Goff, a newly commissioned ensign straight out of midshipman's school in New York, had joined the ship's company at the same time, the Navy having concluded that if watches were to be stood, and even a vessel like a YP kept under sufficient control, at least 2 officers were required to oversee the ship's operations, nothing about previous experience or competence having been considered. There was a war on. People had to come up to the mark and learn on the job. Fortunately for Hal, Ted Hyde, following his own early commissioning during the summer of 1940, had spent more than a year serving as the assistant first lieutenant aboard an attack transport. So Ted, as Hal was invited to call him, did have experience as a watchstander, as a navigator, and with a plethora of other duties ranging from rigging and booms to the handling of small boats. With the august calling of command at sea, he had none. But Ted turned out to be a quick study and sure to pass along to Hal everything that he learned and did. By the time YP-74A reached Australia and moved north to join the invasion force off Guadalcanal, Ted's firm but congenial methods had welded the crew into a tight family. In fact, given the state of morale which Ted had engendered, while the vessel remained on the Navy's list as YP-74A, the crew had gone so far as to dub her the Akanapi, adopting the name of a Native American tribe in imitation of the larger ATFs, the fleet tugs, which also accompanied the invasion force. Needless to say, Akanapi did not appear on anything resembling official correspondence, for which YP-74A had invariably to be used. Nevertheless, the ship's bosun's mates had fashioned a small wooden nameplate and continued to hang it from the rail that surrounded the bridge, save for those occasions when a senior officer's visit happened to be scheduled. Regardless, both Ted Hyde and Hal took as much pride in the nickname as did the crew, and, like the rest of their men, used the name whenever speaking of her among themselves. In fact, the Akanapi did not take part in the initial invasion of Guadalcanal. Instead, having reached Port Moresby in August 1942, she lingered there for 6 or more weeks, towing barges, pushing lighters, assisting ships in offloading or transferring cargoes from ship to shore, and did not go near Guadalcanal until well after the Battle of Savo Island. Finally, in late September, she was sent north, towing 3 lighters loaded down with boxed rations, such mundane items as toilet paper, mortar rounds, barbed wire, canvas, and 3 Army officers who were to do advance planning for the arrival of the Americal Division, which, it was thought, would eventually join or relieve the Marines on the island. Rather than Guadalcanal, the Akanapi found herself based on Tulagi, 32 miles across Iron Bottom Sound from the island where the fighting happened to be taking place. There, occasionally, with so many supply ships moving in and out, she acted as a tug, helping them to move alongside and away from the makeshift pier that had been erected for their use. But as a rule, her main service took place at night, when, with barges or lighters in tow, she made the trip across the Sound, moving supplies of one kind or another from Tulagi to the expanding perimeter that the Marines maintained on Guadalcanal proper. Armed only with a single 20mm Oerlikon with which to attempt to defend herself from air attack, as both Hal and Ted knew, the Akanapi would be a sitting duck for anything like a Japanese surface vessel or a submarine. While Heffling, the ship's gunner's mate, had demonstrated his proficiency in shooting at towed sleeves off the coast of Hawaii, no one on board felt confident that either the man or his 20mm could contend with a Jap Zero, Val, or Kate bent on bombing or strafing them, particularly if they had a string of lighters in tow. Their main protection, and they all knew it, turned out to be their size and the covering that the darkness of the night might afford them. Full and even half moons were their enemies. Fog and cloudy nights, no matter how thick the soup, were the only things that could provide them with comfort on their trips to and from Guadalcanal, and even those, in the event of a close encounter, could not be relied upon. Push came to shove for the Akanapi on the night of Thursday, November 19, 1942, at around 03:15 in the morning, when Ted was on the bridge conning the vessel back across the Sound with 2 empty lighters strung out behind them. The initial problem turned out to be the moon, which was waxing gibbous and almost full beneath a cloudless sky without a hint of fog or mist showing anywhere. At the time, Hal happened to be back on the Fantail, where he'd been sent to check on the crew manning the tow line, a slight chop having given Ted second thoughts about how the tow line might be reacting under the strain. "Baker, how's she looking?" Hal asked the boatswain in charge of the tow back aft, just as another sailor, a man standing nearer the rail, had thrown up his arm to the west and shouted, "What the hell is that?" Hal snapped his head in the direction the man was pointing and knew at once that he was looking at the vague outline of a Japanese submarine, its dark silhouette fully visible in the moonlight no more than 1,000 yards distant. Momentarily, the shock of what he knew he was seeing caused Hal to freeze, but when the boatswain exclaimed, "Shit!" in a voice almost loud enough to be heard on the bridge, Hal came to himself and barked at the sound-powered phone talker to report, "Jap sub to port." By that time, Ted had apparently already seen the sub for himself, given Heffling the order to open fire, and the 20mm had started pumping out rounds with a staccato report. The tracers showed that the rounds were going out high, even as white dots, apparently Japanese sailors, began to emerge onto the sub's main deck and congregate around what Hal imagined to be their deck gun. Then, in what seemed like mere seconds, the Japs loosed their first round, the report sounding like the crack of doom. The round passed straight over the Akanapi's bow. 15 seconds later, at just about the time that Heffling finally got the Oerlikon onto the target, the second Jap round slammed into the Akanapi superstructure, exploding the bridge and the compartments forward with such a fearful concussion that every man aft was thrown straight onto the deck. Before Hal could pick himself up, a third round struck them amidships. Suddenly, Hal found himself in the water and heard the tow line snap almost directly over his head as the Akanapi began to settle. Very quickly, the ship went under, the suction strong enough to take him part way under himself, wrench his legs badly, and strip the shoes from his feet. Relying mostly on the strength of his arms, his legs giving him sharp and searing pain, Hal resurfaced. Gasping for air, he did the only thing he could think to do. He used his arms to propel him toward the nearest lighter, which the Japs had apparently not bothered to take under fire. In the process, he became aware that the boatswain, who had been on the fantail beside him, was also in the water, and with his help, Hal finally reached the lighter and got a grip on the remains of the tow line so as to keep himself from sinking. How the boatswain got up onto the lighter he didn't know, but the sound of voices eventually alerted him to the fact that at least 2 other men were up there with him. Then, clearly, he heard Baker shout, "Here, give me a hand. We've got to get Mr. Goff up here." With effort, the 3 men began to hoist him up the side of the lighter, Hal gripping the tow line for all he was worth until they finally pulled him over the side and helped him down onto the deck. Once out of the water, Hal imagined that he had passed out from the pain, his lower back making him feel like he had been struck by a truck. How long he remained out he didn't know, but when he came to, lying on the deck, he estimated the sun to be at a 45-degree angle from the horizon and imagined that it might be as late as 8 o'clock in the morning. The pain he felt continued to go beyond anything he'd ever experienced. According to the boatswain, he'd also received a major gash across his buttocks, possibly from flying shrapnel, possibly from something he'd struck when they'd been blown from the Akanapi in the moments before she'd gone down. They'd done their best, the boatswain said, to stop the bleeding by stuffing a wet dungaree shirt down the back of his trousers where the gash had been torn. But without first aid equipment, that turned out to be the only thing they could do for him aside from elevating his feet and covering him with a cargo mat to try to prevent shock from setting in. Hal found that he was able to thank them for what they'd tried to do, and then found that if he tried to lie perfectly still, something that was hard to do considering the chop that morning, he could alleviate the pain he felt to at least a minor degree. By noon, all 4 of them, Hal, the boatswain, and the 2 other sailors, the only members of the Akanapi's crew who had survived, felt like they were dying of thirst beneath the broiling tropical sun. It might be a chilly November in Boston, Hal thought, but around Guadalcanal, out in Iron Bottom Sound, the heat felt right on a par with what might be expected around Houston or New Orleans, or somewhere up the Amazon in the midst of a summer swelter. Shortly after the sun reached its blistering zenith, they were rescued. A destroyer headed for Tulagi finding them, taking them in tow, and pulling them on into Tulagi, where Hal was removed on a stretcher to the tents of the Navy's base hospital. Once there, Hal Goff never saw Guadalcanal again. Hal's sojourn in the Navy's Tulagi hospital didn't last long. After administering a local anesthetic, a surgeon who made crude jokes about Hal's bleeding ass sewed him up, gave him strict orders to lie on his stomach, and shipped him straight off along with more than 200 wounded Marines to New Caledonia. There, still unable to stand or walk, he found himself taken aboard a hospital ship and shipped straight back to San Diego, to the Pink Place, the sailor's pet name for Balboa Naval Hospital. After 4 more weeks of recovery and rehabilitation, he regained his ability to stand and walk, and after more rehabilitation, to both swim and run. Finally, 3 days into February 1943, he found himself ushered into a 4-striper's office, the 4-striper being a tall, sallow Navy captain named Hickson, who offered him a seat in front of his desk, bent his head over Hal's file, and finally looked up to say, "From all reports, Mr. Goff, you seem to have recovered. Feeling fit, are you?" "Yes, sir," Hal said. "Expecting some convalescent leave, are you?" "If the Navy is willing to grant me some, sir," Hal replied. "Have some place to go where you can show off that Purple Heart, do you?" Hickson said without showing so much as a trace of a smile. "Yes, sir," Hal said, after a moment's hesitation. "The Navy authorizes you 20 days of convalescent leave, mister, with 1 day travel on either side of it. What that means is that you may swan around at will until 1200 hours sharp on the 25th of February, 1943, at which time you will report yourself to the Personnel Office at Atlantic Fleet Headquarters, Hampton Roads, Norfolk, Virginia, for reassignment. Here are your orders and travel authorizations," he said, hefting a manila envelope and pushing it across the desk for Hal to pick up. "Mind how you go. You don't want that gash on your hip opening back up. And don't be late for reassignment. The Navy takes a very dim view of anyone who fails to meet a commitment." "Yes, sir," Hal said. "Right," Captain Hickson said. "That's it, mister. You're dismissed." And as though brushing a fly from his line of sight with a mere wave of his hand, Hickson sent Hal packing. In a manner of speaking, Ensign Hal Goff, US N.R., had told Captain Hickson a whopper, a porky, an out-and-out lie. He didn't have any place to go for the purpose of showing off a dubiously collected Purple Heart, or for any other reason that he could think of. Hal's parents had died 6 years before in an unfortunate accident on the highway connecting Champaign-Urbana with Rantoul, Illinois, when a drunken Air Corps corporal from Chanute Field plowed straight into them after crossing the center stripe. The uncle who had taken over Hal's upbringing through his last 2 years in high school, and then seen him almost all the way through his degree at the University of Illinois, had died at the beginning of his senior year there, leaving him just enough money to complete his education, and after that, his only real homes had been temporary, the midshipman's school in New York and his confining stateroom on the Akanapi. New York as a place to spend his leave offered more than a plethora of exciting activities to hold his interest, but even with 3 months of back pay in his pocket, he judged Manhattan far too expensive for a leave extending to almost 3 weeks. San Diego seemed to sport a fine climate and offer plenty of attractions to go with it, but as far as Hal knew, the city seemed to be overflowing with such a multitude of sailors and Marines that he felt doubtful that he could even find a seat in a restaurant or an empty stool in a bar. In the end, then, with a B-4 bag filled with the clothing allowance with which the Navy had re-equipped him, he boarded a train, slept sitting in his seat part of the way to Chicago, changed trains in Chicago, and pulled once more into the twin city of Champaign-Urbana, the place his journey had started nearly a year before, and made his way to the same boarding house where he had dossed down in college. Mrs. Rogers, the elderly landlady, greeted him with a smile and even agreed to give him his old room back, with breakfast, for the length of his leave. "I won't ask you where you've been," Mrs. Rogers said, "for I don't suppose you're allowed to say. But I recognize that ribbon you're wearing. You've seen action, haven't you?" "Only in a manner of speaking," Hal said. "Well," Mrs. Rogers said with a smile, "I won't ask further. The ribbon says enough. Same rules as during your student days. Breakfast at 7 o'clock sharp. The doors are locked at 10 p.m., so if you come back late, you'll have to let yourself in with your key. And no girls allowed in the upstairs rooms. If you do bring a girl in, you're free to entertain her in the downstairs parlor. And if you want to eat in at night, you're to let me know by noon so that I can have something on hand for you. Remember all of that, do you?" "Yes," Hal said with a smile. "I do." "Good," Mrs. Rogers said, returning his smile. "It's good to have you back, Hal. I don't know where you've been or what you've been doing, but you'll always be welcome here, and I hope your time with me will give you a good rest." "I'm much obliged, Mrs. Rogers," Hal said. "A good rest in these surroundings is going to do me a world of good." And in keeping with that program, Hal carried his B-4 bag straight upstairs to his old room, stowed his uniforms in the same armoire that he had used across his 4 years as a history major, and slept straight through the afternoon in an attempt to begin his recovery from the rigors he'd left behind him. 2. By the time Hal rose from his bed, got back into his blues and his overcoat, and emerged onto the street in front of Mrs. Rogers' boarding house, the winter sun had already gone down, and a light snow happened to be falling, without wind, so that the tiny flakes settled on the sidewalks without depth. Surrounded by silence, but finding the air cold, Hal raised and buttoned the collar of his overcoat and set off at a brisk pace. He headed 3 blocks up the street for South Goodwin, turned the corner, opened the door beneath the faux wooden balcony railing and French doors that adorned the upstairs facade of the owner's apartment at Pren's, and walked straight into the same college hangout where he had formerly taken so many of his meals. As far as Hal could see, nothing had changed. On his right, the darkly finished counter with the kitchens behind it looked the same, as did the booths on the left, and in the dimly lit, extra-large, high-ceilinged room that bent to the right when one walked deeper into the establishment, Hal could already hear a pickup combo playing an arrangement of "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree." Indeed, he could even see one student, having sweated the label off his beer bottle, fixing it to the top of his wallet before tossing the wallet flat, straight up toward the overhead in an attempt to stick the label to the high ceiling. College traditions, Hal decided, died hard, if they ever died at all. With a smile to no one but himself, he unbuttoned the collar of his overcoat, turned to the man behind the counter, and ordered a hot pastrami sandwich and a beer. Once those were delivered, he walked straight down into the larger room where the combo continued to play. Noticing that the room was only about 3/4 full at the early hour, he found a booth just inside the entrance, seated himself, and quickly tucked into the pastrami. After all the spam he had been forced to eat in the Pacific, it tasted particularly satisfying. Hal had only eaten about half of his pastrami sandwich by the time the little band finished with the Andrews Sisters number, and, to his surprise, the trumpet player and the saxophone player, ambitious music majors, he imagined, launched into an imperfect version of Glenn Miller's Sun Valley Jump. Sensing movement to his side, Hal glanced to his left and was just in time to throw out his arm so as to prevent a person who had stumbled from falling all the way to the floor, regardless of the fact that the books the person carried had spilled straight onto the deck. The sudden weight on his own arm had been nearly enough to jerk Hal straight off his seat. If it had, both of them would have gone down, but they did not. In the wake of the event, Hal's whole attention was drawn downward toward the floor and the spilled books, so that he only looked up finally when the girl, for it was a girl who had caught his arm, said, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and quivered somewhat unsteadily as she tried to recover herself. "Here," Hal said, coming off the bench and leaning over to pick up the girl's books. "Take a seat for a moment so that you can catch your breath." Mildly shaken by her near mishap, the girl did so, quickly sitting down on the corner of the bench across from where Hal had been seated, where she remained almost but not quite breathless. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said again. "What a fool I must look. I'd glanced over at the band, and I shouldn't have. Thank you so much. You've saved me a nasty fall and a heap of embarrassment." "Not at all," Hal said. "It could happen to anyone, and it has certainly happened to me more than once. Feeling better?" "Yes," the girl said, showing him a smile. She seemed older than Hal had realized upon first hearing her voice, but pretty as far as he could see in the dim light, with dark brown hair, brown eyes, and wonderfully shaped lips. "Student, are you?" Hal asked. "Yes," the girl said. "Graduate student." "Studying?" "English Lit, if it doesn't sound too conventional," the girl said, beginning to recover herself and speaking with more poise. "I don't know what your plans may be," Hal said, "but may I offer you a coffee, or a beer, or a sandwich, or something?" Momentarily, Hal could see that the girl hesitated, not knowing what she might be getting herself into. "No strings attached," he said quickly. "I've been on trains for the past 2 days and haven't spoken to a soul the entire time. My name's Hal Goff. I went to school here myself and only graduated in '40, in history." "But you're now in the Navy?" the girl inquired. "Yes," Hal said, "just back from the Pacific." "I'm Bianca Colombo," the girl said, showing him a straightforward expression. "My friends call me B, and you may, too, if you like. I came in for a coffee because I've just spent a long afternoon at the library and need some fortification before I go back to it. I don't know about you, but reading Lawrence Sterne has been a bit of a trial, if you see what I mean." "I'm sorry to say that I've never read Sterne," Hal laughed, "so I'll take your word for it. And please, you just sit tight. The coffee's on me. Cream and sugar?" "No," he said with a smile. "Thank you, but I'll take it black, for the fortification it promises." "So," Hal said, returning to the table a few minutes later with 2 coffees and setting a mug in front of her before once more taking up his sandwich. "Are you from Illinois originally, or from out of state?" "I was born and raised in Herrin," Bee said, sipping her coffee, "down near Carbondale. There's a sizable Lombard community down there, all of them having come over from villages around Milan. My father and his brothers own a construction company." "And you?" "I grew up here," Hal said, "went to Urbana High and started here at the U of I as soon as I graduated from high school." "And you're home on leave?" "In a manner of speaking," Hal said. "In what manner of speaking?" Bee asked. "My parents passed before I started college," Hal said, after swallowing a bite of his sandwich. "And the uncle who was raising me died during my senior year here, so for the length of my leave I'm putting up with Celia Rogers in the same boarding house where I lived during my college years. It's over on West Nevada Street, not far from here." "One hears of sailors having a high time in places like San Francisco, Chicago, or New York," Bee said. "Why here? Why not one of those?" "Ha!" Hal grinned. "If I were only on leave for a day or two, one of those places would have done quite nicely. But even with 3 months back pay, I don't know any ensigns who could afford 20 days in such expensive surroundings. Unless, of course, they resorted to soup kitchens and sleeping on park benches." "Point taken," Bee said, once more removing her lips from her coffee cup. "The Navy does not lavish you with money, then?" "It does not," Hal laughed. "It doesn't make paupers of us, but it is not out to make millionaires of us either." "So, were you drafted?" "I was not," Hal said. "Pearl Harbor stimulated you to do your patriotic duty, then?" Hal took a breath. "Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo have to be stopped," Hal said firmly, "and that's all there is to it." "I agree," Bee said. "And you were in the Pacific?" "I was," Hal said. "So how did you get back so soon? From what I've read in the newspapers, that thing at Guadalcanal continues to be a horror." Hal hesitated. "The long and the short of it," he said finally, "is that my ship was sunk out from under me." "Oh, no," Bee said, caught off guard and instantly exhaling. "Did everyone survive?" Again, Hal hesitated. "No," he said at last, Only 4 of us." "Oh, my God," B said, suddenly stretching out her arm and
Sample complete. Ready to continue?